To the world, Guy Madison was the ultimate American man. Tall, square-jawed, and endlessly charming. He became the face of Westerns in the 1950s, a symbol of rugged masculinity that Hollywood marketed like gold. But what fans didn't know was that behind a polished smile and heroic roles, Guy Madison was living a life far more complex and far more dangerous than anything on screen. Born Robert Ozell Mosley in 1922, he was just another naval enlistee when a Warner Brothers talent scout spotted him on leave. One photo shoot later, and the dream began. The studios quickly rebranded him Guy Madison, polishing him into their next matinee idol. With almost no acting experience, he was thrown into the Hollywood machine and skyrocketed to fame. Audiences couldn't get enough. Madison was cast as Wild Bill Hickok in the long-running TV series of the same name, making him one of television's earliest breakout stars. By the mid-1950s, he was on the covers of fan magazines and adored by millions of women. But even as his public image soared, his private reality remained locked behind a carefully constructed facade. Because in old Hollywood, image wasn't just everything, it was survival. Guy was signed and managed by Henry Wilson, the same powerful agent who created Rock Hudson, Tab Hunter, and other heartthrobs of the era. Wilson was known for creating macho personas for his clients while privately knowing, sometimes even blackmailing, their secrets. Under Wilson's watch, Guy Madison was molded into a wholesome, all-American icon, the kind that could never afford to be caught deviating from the image studios worked so hard to sell. At the time, rumors circulated quietly, always behind closed doors, never in print. A few in the inner circle knew Madison's story wasn't as clean-cut as it appeared. Hollywood, even then, was a town built on secrets. But if you were caught breaking the rules, especially the unspoken ones around sexuality, you weren't just risking your reputation. You were risking your livelihood. And Guy Madison had a lot to lose. There were whispers, small, carefully buried stories about private parties, clandestine relationships, and sudden studio fixes. There were friendships that seemed unusually intense, and marriages that felt more like press campaigns and love affairs. But in an industry that could bury the truth as easily as it created illusions, none of this ever saw the light of day until much later. And that's what makes Madison's story so different. Because in recent years, the whispers have become louder. Documents, interviews, and even long-lost memoirs have begun to resurface, pulling back the curtain on a life that was far more layered than the Westerns he starred in. It's not just about who he was behind closed doors. It's about how far the industry would go to keep that door shut. But the most startling revelations were still to come, ones that would rewrite everything fans thought they knew. If you wanted to make it in 1950s Hollywood, you needed more than talent. You needed the right protector. And for Guy Madison, that man was Henry Wilson. On paper, Wilson was one of the most successful talent agents of his era. He discovered and managed some of the most desirable leading men of the Golden Age, including Rock Hudson, Troy Donahue, Tab Hunter, and yes, Guy Madison. But behind his polished office doors, Wilson was something else entirely. A kingmaker with secrets, leverage, and the power to make or break careers overnight. When Madison came under Wilson's management, the transformation began immediately. Robert Ozell Mosley became Guy Madison, a name that sounded heroic, clean-cut, and irresistibly marketable. The studios loved it, so did audiences. But everything about Madison's image was manufactured, and Wilson knew that better than anyone. He didn't just guide careers, he curated identities. And in Madison's case, that identity had to be spotless, masculine, and heterosexual to a fault. The truth? Madison's personal life didn't fit that narrative. While there's no official record that he ever came out, how could he? There's been growing speculation, supported by industry insiders and biographers, that Madison's romantic interests didn't align with the fantasy Wilson was selling to the public. And Wilson, a closeted gay man himself, was an expert at maintaining that illusion for a price. He built a system where secrets weren't just tolerated, they were currency. If one of his clients strayed too far from the script, Wilson had ways to fix it. Marriages of convenience, stage dates with starlets, gossip items fed to magazines. He controlled the narrative like a puppet master. And while some of his clients benefited from this tight control, others lived in quiet fear of what might happen if they slipped. Madison's career soared in the early 50s, but there were odd gaps and sudden slowdowns that left fans confused. Industry insiders whisper that Wilson occasionally punished clients who stepped out of line, professionally or personally. If true, it paints a chilling picture. Madison may have been both protected and imprisoned by the very man who made him a star. One former studio assistant claimed that Wilson kept folders on everyone as actors, full of compromising material, rumors, and backroom agreements. Whether these were real or exaggerated is still debated, but it wouldn't be surprising. This was a time when being exposed didn't just end your career. It could destroy your life. Madison, like many of Wilson's clients, walked a tightrope. In public, he was the perfect leading man. In private, he was someone else entirely, careful, guarded, and constantly aware of how fragile it all was. And yet, despite all the control, all the silence, some truths still managed to leak through, not through interviews or headlines, but through the stories passed from one insider to another, and eventually into the archives of Hollywood's forgotten history. But that wasn't the end of it, because some of Madison's most private connections were still to be revealed long after his stardom faded. For years, Guy Madison played the role of the rugged romantic lead, often seen riding horses, fighting outlaws, and winning over women on screen. Off-screen, though, the real story was much murkier. Whispers about his private relationships, specifically with other men, circulated quietly in the back rooms of Hollywood, passed along like forbidden knowledge. While nothing was ever officially confirmed, recent biographies, memoirs, and interviews with insiders have brought some of those buried truths back into the light. One of the most persistent rumors links Madison to fellow actor Rory Calhoun. Both men were managed by Henry Wilson at one point, and their careers followed eerily similar paths: handsome, marketable, and often pushed into overly macho roles. Calhoun himself had a criminal past that studios worked hard to cover up, and many believe Wilson used that dirt as leverage. Some suggest Madison and Calhoun had more than just professional ties. Whether romantic or not, their relationship was reportedly close. So close that when Calhoun suddenly distanced himself, people behind the scenes raised eyebrows. Then there's the story of Madison's rumored relationship with a young studio publicist. The man, who never went on record publicly, allegedly kept letters from Madison that were surprisingly personal. Though the letters were never published, fragments of them were cited in a tell-all book written in the early 2000s, long after both men had passed. The tone of the correspondence, as described by the author, painted a portrait of a deeply conflicted man, struggling to express emotions he couldn't risk showing the world. And perhaps the most controversial name of all to surface in connection with Madison, Rock Hudson. While Hudson's hidden life has since become one of the most well-documented examples of Hollywood's double life, what's less known is the speculation that he and Madison were briefly involved during the early stages of their careers. Both were managed by Wilson. Both lived in the same housing arrangements for a period. Both were molded into fantasy figures by the same man. Coincidence? Maybe. But to those who knew them, the similarities went beyond career moves. Madison eventually married actress Gail Russell, but that relationship, too, came under scrutiny. Some insiders have described the marriage as studio arranged, more about optics than intimacy. It didn't last long, and Russell's life soon spiraled into addiction and tragedy, another story Hollywood preferred to ignore. After the divorce, Madison rarely dated publicly again. It's worth noting that these stories didn't come from tabloids or fan gossip. They came from former assistants, co-stars, and unpublished memoirs of studio executives. People who had every reason to stay quiet for decades finally began to speak. Once careers were over, contracts had expired, and fear no longer held them back. For Madison, those forbidden romances never saw the light of day during his lifetime, but they were never fully erased either. Instead, they lingered like ghosts in the background as legacy, waiting to be uncovered. And the deeper you dig into those stories, the clearer it becomes. This was never just about Madison. It was about how Hollywood controlled desire, and how the price of fame often included hiding who you really were. But even that wasn't the full story, because the machine behind the secrecy was far more calculated and far more ruthless than anyone could have imagined. Old Hollywood wasn't just built on talent. It was built on silence. Behind the glitz and glamour of premieres and red carpets, the studios ran like covert operations. They controlled everything: the roles, the press coverage, even the personal lives of their stars. And when it came to protecting the image of leading men like Guy Madison, they didn't hesitate to go to extreme lengths. The unspoken rule was simple: appearances came first. If an actor's real life threatened the studio's carefully crafted illusion, they either played along or paid the price. And for someone like Madison, who was rumored to be hiding same-sex relationships in a deeply homophobic era, the consequences of exposure could have been catastrophic. Studio contracts back then weren't just about film commitments. They often included morality clauses, vague but powerful tools that allowed executives to fire or blackball actors for anything deemed inappropriate or damaging to the brand. These clauses were used like weapons, especially against those who stepped out of line. It wasn't just legal pressure, either. Studios hired private investigators to trail their own talent, keeping tabs on who they saw, where they went, and what could potentially leak to the press. Rumors suggest that Guy Madison was one of many actors quietly monitored after hours, especially during the peak of his fame. One former studio fixer even admitted that his job included intercepting letters, scrubbing gossip columns, and paying off hotel staff to keep things quiet. If an actor was seen with the wrong person, studios could arrange a quick photo op with a female co-star to redirect attention. These were often staged dates, photographed and distributed to magazines to reassure fans. Madison had more than a few of these photo ops. But if that didn't work, or if someone started talking, the studios didn't hesitate to resort to intimidation or career sabotage. In some cases, actors were coerced into marrying their female colleagues, simply to squash rumors. A marriage was the ultimate shield against suspicion. Madison's brief marriage to Gail Russell raised questions not just because it ended quickly, but because of the oddly timed publicity around it. Insiders have long suspected it was engineered as damage control, not romance. Meanwhile, the tabloids were complicit. Publications like Confidential magazine were notorious for publishing scandalous content, but they were also known to trade stories. A studio might offer a scoop about a lesser-known actor in exchange for suppressing something more dangerous, like a rumor about Madison's private life. It was blackmail, just packaged as journalism. And still, even with all this machinery working in the background, cracks formed, people slipped up, stories leaked, and little by little, the illusion began to erode. Guy Madison lived under this microscope for years, playing the role the studio demanded, walking the line, never letting the mask slip. But the weight of that silence, it never left him. And just when Hollywood thought the story had been buried for good, new voices emerged, challenging the old narrative and exposing the cracks they tried so hard to seal. For decades, the truth about Guy Madison seemed destined to fade with the passing of time. Hollywood had done its job, keeping the myth alive while burying the man. But history has a strange way of resurfacing. And in Madison's case, the silence surrounding his private life didn't just break. It began to unravel, piece by piece, long after he left the spotlight. It started quietly. A 2003 memoir from a retired studio assistant mentioned a leading man from the 50s with steel blue eyes and a secret no one dared speak of. Though the book never named Madison directly, readers familiar with the industry put the pieces together. The description matched him perfectly, and that was just the beginning. Soon after, an estate sale in Palm Springs turned up something far more direct. A small box of personal letters, photographs, and keepsakes said it belonged to one of Madison's close companions. Inside were candid snapshots, nothing explicit but intimate, showing Madison in casual, off-camera moments, often with the same young man. According to those who reviewed the contents before they were quietly removed from auction, the tone and content hinted at far more than friendship. Then came the documentaries. A few independent filmmakers and LGBTQ+ historians began to re-examine old Hollywood with a different lens. In one such project, Madison's name came up alongside other closeted stars of the era, actors whose careers were managed, manipulated, and sanitized to protect both studio profits and outdated moral codes. While no bombshell confession tape has ever surfaced, what did emerge were a growing number of testimonies, friends, distant relatives, and even former colleagues who had nothing to gain and no reason to lie. One particularly chilling quote came from a retired MGM publicist who said, "There were at least a dozen leading men in the 50s who played cowboys by day and hit everything else by night. Guy was one of them. The studios knew. Everyone knew, but no one said a word." These testimonies, along with unearthed documents, painted a fuller, more human portrait of Madison, not as a scandalous figure, but as a man forced to live half a life. Someone whose career success came with an unspoken contract. Be who we say you are, or lose everything. In 2010, a former journalist released a podcast episode focused entirely on Madison's life, using never-before-heard interviews from makeup artists, wardrobe assistants, and background actors. They described a man who was warm, professional, but also visibly anxious anytime someone from the studio showed up unannounced. He was always looking over his shoulder, one woman said. Even in moments when he was happy, it felt like he couldn't fully relax. It was through these scattered stories, half-finished letters, and quiet recollections that Madison's truth began to breathe again. Not in headlines or tabloid exposés, but in the margins where real life tends to leave its traces. And just when the world began to see Madison in a new light, a forgotten scandal emerged, one that even the studios had tried to destroy. By the mid-1950s, Guy Madison was a household name, with a chiseled jaw, all-American charm, and a leading role in the hit TV series The Adventures of Wild Bill Hickok. He was at the peak of his career, but behind the scenes, the pressure was building. And then came the moment that nearly shattered everything. It started with a private party in the Hollywood Hills, exclusive invitation only, and attended mostly by industry insiders. These gatherings were common among closeted actors at the time, carefully arranged to provide freedom away from the press and studio surveillance. But on this particular night, something went wrong. A local tabloid stringer, tipped off by an angry ex-lover of one of the guests, parked down the street with a camera and a long lens. According to multiple unpublished sources, and one particularly damning anecdote shared in a 1998 biography of Henry Wilson, Madison was among the high-profile guests photographed leaving the event in the early hours of the morning, arm in arm with another man. That single photograph, never published but reportedly circulated privately among tabloid editors and studio executives, caused chaos behind closed doors. The studios went into full damage control mode. According to one former publicity agent, that photo was a bullet. It was only a matter of time before someone fired it. But Wilson, Madison's longtime agent, stepped in fast. He'd pulled off dozens of cleanups like this before. Sources claim he arranged a massive distraction, leaking a salacious and completely fabricated affair between two other rising stars to Confidential magazine. It worked. The press shifted focus, and the photo disappeared from circulation. Whether it was bought, destroyed, or locked away, no one knows for sure. But its impact lingered. Madison's relationship with Wilson reportedly soured after that. The trust was broken. He began distancing himself from the agent who had once controlled every move of his career. Around this time, Madison's role started drying up. The Western genre was fading, and with it, his carefully crafted persona began to lose its shine. Though the scandal was never made public, the industry had a long memory. Casting directors stopped calling. Madison found himself doing low-budget foreign films and forgettable guest spots on TV, a far cry from the stardom he once knew. Many believed the silent exile wasn't about fading popularity. It was punishment, a quiet erasure orchestrated by studios that no longer saw him as safe. It was a reminder of how brutal the system could be. One misstep, one rumor, one photograph, and it could all be gone. And for Madison, that moment became the beginning of a slow fade into the margins of Hollywood history. But even as his star dimmed, he refused to speak publicly about what really happened. He stayed silent until the end, protecting not just himself, but the people he had once loved and the reputation he had paid so dearly to build. Still, silence doesn't erase everything. And decades later, one final chapter would emerge, revealing how Madison tried to make peace with the truth he'd been forced to hide for so long. As Guy Madison's name faded from marquee lights and magazine covers, he quietly withdrew from the industry that once defined him. By the 1970s, he had moved to Europe, appearing in a string of spaghetti westerns and war films, roles far removed from the wholesome American image he'd once represented. But for those paying close attention, Madison's final years weren't just about survival. They were about something far more human: quiet reconciliation. Friends close to Madison in his later life describe him as a man changed, not bitter, but distant. He never publicly addressed the rumors that had trailed him for decades, never confirmed or denied the relationships whispered about in back rooms, but he also stopped running from them. According to one Italian filmmaker who worked with Madison in the early 80s, he was at peace with himself by then. You could tell he didn't pretend anymore. This was the same period when Madison stopped granting interviews altogether. No retrospectives, no memoir, no rebuttals. He had the opportunity to rewrite his legacy, to deny the things that had been said. Instead, he chose silence, a powerful choice in a town that runs on spin and image control. But even in silence, truth has a way of leaking out. After his death in 1996, a private collection of personal writings was quietly passed to a film historian by one of Madison's longtime friends. The contents, never made public in full, included notes, short reflections, and what appeared to be journal entries dating back to the late 1960s. One entry, reportedly written just after the breakup of a long-term friendship, read, "I lived a lie so long I forgot what the truth felt like. But love, real love, never forgets you, even if the world does." The entries don't name anyone, and they never directly acknowledge his hidden relationships. But the tone is unmistakable: melancholy, honest, regretful, and beneath the surface, there's a sense that Madison was using the only safe space he had left, his private thoughts, to confront the identity Hollywood had forced him to suppress. He spent his final years near Palm Springs, surrounded by a small circle of friends. Those close to him say he rarely spoke about his career, and when he did, it was a strange mix of gratitude and sadness. He knew what he'd given up, one longtime companion said, but he also knew what he'd kept for himself: quiet moments, real connections, even if the world never saw them. Perhaps the most revealing tribute came from a fellow actor who'd also lived under the weight of studio secrets. Speaking anonymously in a 2001 documentary, he said, "We were all pretending, but Guy, he carried it with grace. He never sold out who he was, even when he had to hide it." And maybe that was Madison's final message. Not a tell-all or a scandalous reveal, but a quiet refusal to let the industry rewrite his truth completely. A legacy not of controversy, but of courage, lived in the margins and remembered in fragments. But the story doesn't end there, because what happened after his death would finally push his long-buried truth into the open and force Hollywood to reckon with the system it built. When Guy Madison passed away in 1996, the obituaries were respectful but restrained. Most stuck to the basics: his run on Wild Bill Hickok, a few film roles, a brief mention of his modeling past. It was a clean, studio-friendly narrative, the same one they'd pushed for decades. But what they didn't expect, what the studios could never fully control, was a conversation that would begin after his death. Because for a new generation of Hollywood historians, LGBTQ+ advocates, and truth-seeking fans, Madison wasn't just another forgotten heartthrob. He was a symbol of something much larger, a life lived under pressure, wrapped in silence, and shaped by an industry that punished authenticity. And once people started talking, they didn't stop. In the early 2000s, film forums and niche blogs began sharing stories in fragments, scattered quotes from old co-workers, archived interviews with his agent, whispers from long-forgotten biographies. Slowly, a fuller picture came into view, and for many it was heartbreaking. Madison had spent most of his adult life playing someone else, on screen and off, not for artistic expression, but for survival. That kind of sacrifice doesn't stay buried forever. By the 2010s, Guy Madison's name started appearing in discussions about closeted Hollywood stars, alongside Rock Hudson, Tab Hunter, and others who'd also been forced to hide who they were. The difference? Many of those men had come forward, at least partially. Madison never had that chance. Or maybe he simply never felt safe enough to take it. In 2018, an independent film archive released a special retrospective on Madison's career. Quietly, respectfully, they acknowledged the decades of rumors and the patterns of studio manipulation that likely kept him silent. It was the first time a public-facing organization dared to say what many had long suspected. Guy Madison had been more than the roles he played, and his truth had been systematically erased. That moment cracked something open. Suddenly, interviews that had once been buried were resurfacing. A former lover, never named publicly, shared audio excerpts recorded in the late 1980s, where Madison reportedly spoke, carefully but clearly, about feeling boxed in by the world's expectations. Though the tapes have never been fully authenticated or released, their impact was felt. For many fans and film historians, they were the final confirmation. And then came the tributes. Young actors, especially from the LGBTQ+ community, began citing Madison not as a cautionary tale, but as a quiet hero, a man who endured, adapted, and survived in a time when even a whisper of truth could ruin everything. Today, Guy Madison's story is more than just old gossip or industry myth. It's a reminder of the cost of silence and the strength it takes to keep going when the world demands a lie. His legacy, once confined to black and white westerns and forgotten movie posters, now lives in a deeper truth, one that Hollywood tried to erase but couldn't. And now that he's finally broken the silence, through letters, whispers, and history refusing to stay buried, there's one thing we can say for sure. They kept his truth hidden for decades, but they couldn't erase it forever.